not Hallie, but good morning and welcome to Wallace State Community College. My name is Paul Knetter, and I'm a student here. I'm also a member of Sigma Kappa Delta, the English Honor Society. It is the honor society for students who excel in English courses. If you're interested in this organization, please come by the... Can everybody hear me? Please come by the English department in Wilson Hall for an application. Our event this morning is sponsored by the Common Read Committee and Wallace State Learning Communities. The event will end in time for you to make your 11 o'clock classes, so please be seated until its conclusion. Tickets for proof of attendance will be provided following the event. And also, if you haven't already, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. The event will be followed by a Q&A session, as well as time for the speaker to sign autographs. So imagine a moment so dramatic that it could define you for the rest of your days, that it could change what you do, how you do it, and call into question every dream you've ever dared chase. What happens when you arrive back at square one? For Tricia Downing, a competitive athlete, life was all about an active existence, freedom, and seeking out her next big adventure. What happens when you arrive back at square one? That was until the day tragedy struck and everything changed. Arriving in unknown territory, Tricia found herself relearning simple tasks, reinventing her life, and redefining able. In making her comeback to athletics and racing, Tricia took lessons she learned through her journey in rehabilitation with her to the start line, realizing that life is just another sport, and the training we do makes the difference between simply being in the race and raising your arms across the finish line. Embark on a journey of self-discovery and explore the essence of the human spirit with our speaker as she shares how strength, courage, and perseverance turn I can't into I can when faced with seemingly overwhelming challenges. Please welcome Tricia Downing.
You'll likely hit on the fact that I'm as old as your parents. Heaven forbid, but yes, the year was 1986. We would graduate in the spring of that school year, June of 1987. At the time, even June seemed light years away, but our conversation quickly turned to the future. Only 8 months before we graduate, Lisa would say, the class of 1987. Can you believe it? It used to seem so far away. I can't believe it's next year, I said. Yeah, time flies, huh? Kara said. No kidding, said Teddy. Time to grow up. Sort of. We each agreed to Lisa's statement in turn. Then there was Kate. Hey guys, what do you think they'll call the class of 2000? Do you think they'll be called the class of 0? Kate was always a jokester, and we giggled all the time. We giggled because at the time, the year 2000 seemed like a very futuristic place. Wow, now that seems light years away, a voice chimed in. In the year 2000, we'll be in our 30s. Can you imagine? That seems so old. I wonder if we'll still be friends. I wonder what we'll be doing. Do you think we'll be married and have jobs and kids? Our imaginations were immediately turned on, and we began to talk about all of the things that were science fiction to us. Video phones, self-driving cars, writing college papers on a computer instead of a typewriter. Wow, yes, 1987 was a very different time than today. I can remember as a high school student thinking that life was one long road to be lived from one end to the other, that everything happened sequentially and exactly in order. High school graduation, college, meet the boy of my dreams, find a $60,000 a year job, marry said boy, buy a house, have kids. It never occurred to me to think any differently. But on the way to the good-looking guy and the $60,000 a year job and a cool apartment, or better yet, a house, and maybe a trip to Europe with friends, somehow I got my signals crossed. I did graduate, but instead of that great job, I ended up working 2 or 3 jobs at a time to make ends meet. I went through different boyfriends, some good, some bad, but no marriage prospects on the horizon, not to mention that house and kids. They were no longer even on the radar. That straight line of life landmarks had turned into a jagged mess of here and there and everywhere. And then came September 17th, that highly anticipated year of 2000. Life, my life, threw at me a much different scenario than I could have ever expected. Not only was life not unfolding the way I'd always planned and taken for granted, on a very normal training ride, spending time with a friend, exercising my body, on that day, at the corner of 32nd and Crabapple, my life hit a crossroads and everything changed. It goes without saying that that was the scariest day of my life. My friends and family also felt the blow. I've often thought that that day of the accident and the days following were the closest I would get to seeing my very own funeral. I thought, I'm seeing the people who would show up, who was devastated, who was stoic, and who would pick up the pieces and who would retreat, unable to face what had just happened. I don't recommend it. But that day, my life was irreversibly changed. And my father, a physician, who was a realist, he took my family, my brothers, my family, my friends, into a waiting room, and he said, basically, her life is over. My dad thought that was the end of life as I would live it, because he thought having a disability wasn't something that would lead to a productive and happy life. Basically, it was a deal breaker. Mentally, for me, it was a hard thing to wrap my head around. I thought bad things like this only happened to the people that you see online. It was like that surreal experience you get when you watch the news and you see widespread devastation like that which has occurred recently from a series of hurricanes and earthquakes. Watching that, you feel empathy and worry and marvel at the human spirit as you watch people put the pieces back together again. But it's a much different feeling when it's your life that has been upended, when you have to figure out how to collect yourself and move on. Recovery from any massive life change is a gradual process. Sometimes you don't notice yourself changing and growing, but in the end, when you look back on it, you realize how far you've come. That's exactly what I found rewarding about writing my book, Cycle of Hope, which I hope you've all read and enjoyed. I'm often asked if it was a grueling process to write about all the emotions and the difficult times that I went through. But I actually found it liberating more than anything, because I could see how my life changed in an instant, but then how I went through each one of those changes and those challenges and emotions, and I emerged a person who I think is much better than the person that I was before my accident. I realized how much I had learned, how many different ways that I could contribute to the world and how I would live my life differently. When I had gotten out of the hospital, I started journaling, and I don't know why really, but I'm glad that I did, because it gave me a chance to put my emotions out on paper and to see what my life could truly become. Because in the beginning, all I could talk about was how miserable I was and how this change was a life change that I didn't appreciate and that I couldn't love myself and that I couldn't be the person I wanted to be. But by the end of my journals, the journals I write today, they're so much different. I'm giving so much more of myself to the world, and I'm seeing that I've been able to do much more than I ever would have without the accident. Now, I can only think of the amount of times that my life has changed in a single day. Probably on one hand, I can think of those many times. The first one was last summer when I found out the name and the identity of my biological mother. The other times that my life has changed, my wedding day, of course, the day of my mother's death in 2011. Of course, the accident was the biggest change that I've ever gone through in my life. But aside from that, one of the other biggest changes that I've been through is is when I went off to college. And I remember that day when I finished packing my bags and I turned the light off on my bedroom and I walked out of my room and I realized that things were never going to be the same again. I was growing up. I was crossing the country 2,000 miles to go to school at the University of Vermont, and I knew right then that things were never going to be the same. I suspect that many of you are going through that change of going off to college for your first year and realizing that life is going to move into all these different ways. And that straight line that I talked about earlier is what I want to talk about today, because life is full of changes, and obviously I've been through a lot with my accident and my injury, and I've learned a lot of things about dealing with change that I feel are some things that I would like to share with you all today. The more that I've started talking about my accident, the more I've realized what change is about. And so today, I'm going to share with you some of those things. Now, I think dealing with change, the most important thing for you to have is a big bank account. And I know you all are looking at this and thinking, what does having a lot of money have to do with going through change? But it's actually the bank account where you store your personal assets, the things that you have gathered over the course of a lifetime that will help you get through change. And some of those assets I'd like to share with you today. You can see on my slide, hopefully you can read: discipline and health, faith, finances, friends, hopes. Well, some of the things that I found important when I was going through my changes were having other people that I could rely on, having a support system. And I consider having a support system, there are 4 different groups of people that I rely on when I have a support system. Those are my mentors, my coaches, my cheerleaders, and my challengers. Well, I had met my mentors long before my accident. I had no idea who they were or the importance that they were going to take in my life. When I started bike racing in my late 20s, I had a coach who encouraged me to not only race my own bike, but to be involved in a program with athletes with disabilities. And these athletes, the athletes that I was involved in, were visually impaired, and they raced bikes on tandems. So they were sitting on the back of a 2-person bike, and I would be the tandem pilot. I would be the eyes for the bike, and together we would power them. And as a part of this tandem team, I qualified for the national championships for the disabled, and then we qualified for the world championships for the disabled. And of course, at that time, I didn't have a disability, but I was helping others who did. And we were riding together, going on courses all over the country, making it from start to finish as a team. And as part of the entire team, not just myself and my blind stoker or the person who rides on the back of the bike, as part of the team, we had other athletes who had other disabilities. We had athletes with cerebral palsy on our team. We had athletes who were wheelchair racers. And there I was able to see athletes with disabilities who were moving on in their lives, who were doing exactly what I was doing, pushing my body and racing to the very finish. And so those people were my mentors. They were the wise men and women that I could look back on when I had my accident. And those are the people that I encourage you all to be able to reach out to as you're here at school. Those mentors are the people who are doing the things that you might want to do when you grow up, perhaps being nurses or doctors, successful business people, because mentors make a huge difference in your life. And I believe that those mentors, when I was involved with this disabled sports group, they were people who were maybe sent into my life to help me deal with a problem that would come along later. But some of the coaches that I had in my life were the physical therapists and occupational therapists, the people that I had with me at the hospital who were able to teach me different things to get through my life. The therapist that I liked working with the best, one of them was named Stacy, and you were able to read about her in my book. Stacy taught me my very first physical therapy lesson when she picked me up at my room the first day, and she took me down to the gym in the hospital where I was doing my rehab, and she laid me down on a mat, And she said, okay, Trish, the first thing that you need to learn is how to sit up. Because I had just gone through this accident, been paralyzed, learned that I had to live my life in a wheelchair, and I was going to have to learn how to get around. But there's no way to get around if you can't sit up first thing in the morning. And if you think about it, think about how simple that is. Probably when your alarm went off this morning, that was the first thing that you did. Although some of you probably hit the snooze. Sitting up is probably the first thing you did. And so Stacy took me down to the gym, and she laid me down on this therapy mat. And she said, okay, Trish, go. And so I did what I always do. I tightened my stomach muscles and sent that signal from my head to my body that says sit up, and nothing happened. I had no idea that when you're paralyzed from the chest down, you can't just sit up. And so I looked up at Stacy, and my face got flush, and my eyes filled with tears, and I said, Stacy, what am I going to do with my life if I can't do the most basic thing that everyone does every morning? And Stacy, as my coach, one of the most important people in my rehab, she said, you know what, Trish, I'll give you this. You have a long way to go. But just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean that you won't be able to do all the same things that you've ever done. She said, you're just going to have to learn to do them in new ways. And I didn't believe her at first until she had taught me to roll over on my side and push up on my elbow and push up on my hand and arrive at a seating position. And that was one of the most important lessons I learned from one of my coaches, and that there's always more than one way to achieve a goal. And she taught me that day. That was one of the most important lessons that I remember to this day. But there was another person who was very important as a coach who helped me heal and was part of my support system. And that was a woman named Claire. And Claire was this tall, athletic, lean woman who came bounding into my room one day, and she introduced herself, and she said, Trish, you came into the hospital as an athlete. I want to make sure that you leave here as an athlete. And so she said, you know, pretty much any activity that you can think of has been adapted for somebody in a wheelchair. And she asked me what I would like to do. She said we could play golf or tennis, we could go water skiing, scuba diving. And I looked at her and I said, you know, all I've ever wanted to do was be a cyclist. I only want to ride a bike. And she said, well, I have just the thing for you. And so she took me down to the rec therapy room, and she showed me this. It was a hand cycle. Oh, sorry, wrong photo. She showed me a hand cycle, and she showed me that it was something that I could do just like I had been doing before. She transferred me down onto this bike, and I was literally able to ride out of the hospital, down the hall, and out into the street. So these mentors and coaches were the people who helped me get through this difficult situation. But more important than that were the cheerleaders in my life. And if you look around this auditorium, many of you have cheerleaders or people who will become your cheerleaders over the course of your school time. Because you all will go through so many things together that you will turn to these people as friends, and they will be part of your support system to help you get through the changes and the challenges that face you as you're at school at Wallace State. And the last group of people in my support system, I call my challengers. Now, I think your challengers, I don't look at that as an adversarial type of thing, but your challengers are people who help you achieve more. They're the people that are your classmates, maybe your study buddies, maybe somebody who's doing a little bit better in your class, and they help you strive to be a better person, to help you study more, and to help you do better in your classes. So as far as change, I think that having a support system is one of the most important things, and one of the things that helped me get through this accident. But the other thing was discipline. And discipline was something that I learned as I was going out on this bike ride with Claire, and she was showing me around the neighborhood around Craig Hospital. And as we were riding, my arms felt literally like noodles because I had been just lying in bed for 8 weeks, and here I was now going on a bike ride where I had to ride completely with my arms. And so we rode around the neighborhood of the hospital, and as we got back to the hospital, Claire said, "Hey, how'd you like it? Did you really enjoy that bike ride?" And I said, "Claire, I'm used to riding 70 and 80 and 90 miles at a time. I don't see how I'm ever going to get any satisfaction riding this bike 2 or 3 miles." I said, "How am I going to do that?" And she said, "You're going to do it the same way that you do anything that's new or challenging. You're going to work hard, do a little more every day, stay patient, and don't give up." And I realized there that she was giving me the recipe for discipline, which I believe is another one of the assets that you can contain for overcoming change. But then after we went on this ride, I went back to my life at the hospital and learned all the other things that I needed to learn, until a day that she came back to my room and she showed me this. I believe it just flashed on the screen. I'm sorry. It was a racing chair. And the racing chair was something a little bit different than the hand cycle. It was something that you got into and tucked into a little ball, and you had to literally push on the push rims of the chair to make it go forward. And so Claire took me down the road to a park that was near the hospital, and there was about a little bit less than a 2-mile road through the park, and she said, "Okay, I'm going to teach you how to push this chair." So she put these big black gloves on my hands, and I started pushing around the park, but I wasn't getting very far. It was 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch, and eventually she had to push me a little bit, and then I pushed myself a little bit. And when I got all the way around the park in this racing chair, she asked me how I liked it. And I looked at Claire and I said, "That was the most work for the least return I have ever experienced in my entire life." But she said, "You'll be able to push this racing chair just as far as you want if you work hard, do a little more every day, stay patient, and don't give up." And so I learned to be one of the second most important parts of facing change and dealing with challenges, to being disciplined. And each one of you are learning discipline as you go through your classes and you study harder. And each day, if you work hard, do a little more every day, stay patient, and don't give up, you will be able to reach the dreams and the goals that you're striving for. The third asset, that I believe that you need besides a support system and discipline is this: believing in yourself. Now, have you ever thought about your personal motto? I had a friend who posed that question on her Facebook page one day. She asked, in 5 words or less, what is the motto by which you live your life? And when I read that, I had to think about it for a minute, and then a smile crossed my face, and I typed into the computer, "Always believe you can." Now, I think I came up with that so easily because that's the way that I was raised. But I think it's also something that's important for each one of you to think about: what is your personal philosophy for success? What is that thing that you can use to encourage yourself so that when you reach tough times, that you are able to move forward and be able to accomplish your goals? Believing in yourself, though, requires a certain amount of confidence, and you have to be confident in your ability to face and overcome adversity. So how do you build this fourth character trait that I'm talking about? The answer to this question is to know who you are and what you want out of life. Do you want your current difficulties to take over, make your decisions, or define you? Of course not. And I think at this point, we've all had difficult situations in the past and plenty of experiences to draw on. You just don't always think that way. In your mind right now, I want you to come up with a challenge that you faced in the past and think about how it made you feel. Were you scared at first, frustrated, upset? Then think about what you did to handle that situation. Are there actions that you drew upon at that time that you could use again? I usually look at my trials in the context of a race. Oftentimes, racing takes you to your very limit. You begin to wonder if you can finish what you started. Your body hurts and your competitors threaten to take away the prize that you worked so hard for. But as it has been said in sports, are 90% mental and 10% physical. And to build that mental side where your confidence lives, I have several exercises that you can do. You know what? I'm going to start all over again because I can tell that this speech is not reaching you in the way that I had hoped, and I'm not speaking in the way that is natural for me. I want to tell you about what it's really like going through this accident and this injury. I think for the students who are in the medical programs, the students who are here trying to overcome challenges, I would rather just be real with you. I could talk about this all day, about going through change and how to face challenges, but I'd rather just tell you the truth about my accident. Let me start from the very beginning. I know you all have read the book, and so I wanted to try to give you something a little bit different, but I don't want to sit here and preach like I'm teaching to you, because the truth of it is, when you get hit by a car, when you're paralyzed from the chest down, everything changes. People look at you differently. People think that you have a disability, and this disability somehow makes you different. It makes you not as valuable of a person. And so this was something that I went through as I had my injury, feeling that I had suddenly become a second-class citizen, that I wasn't as important as everybody else. And it took me to a really low place. And I know that sometimes when you're sitting alone and you're by yourself, you get this demon that sits on your shoulder. Have you ever had that demon when you're in a low place and you're thinking, I'm not worthwhile. I shouldn't be here. I'm not achieving my goals. I had that demon that was sitting square on my shoulder for the longest time. But then I would go out into the community, and it wasn't any easier because I had people looking me up and down because I now carried this new label, disabled. And if you look disabled up in the dictionary, it says things like broken, crippled, damaged. And I wondered if that's what people really thought about me. And it made me realize the labels that we use for each other and how these labels put people in little boxes. And it only takes into consideration just 1% of who that person is. And it encloses us up, and it doesn't allow us to blossom into the people that we are. And for the longest time, I was living in that box with that label. And I would look at myself in the mirror at these legs that used to power a bicycle, and here they were sitting lifeless in my chair. And it took me a long time to be able to get past that stage. And it took me thinking back to something that my doctor once told me. She said I'd have an easier time getting through this injury because I was an athlete. And I didn't realize what that meant at first until I realized that as an athlete, I had been building this mental toughness and this physical awareness my entire life. And maybe I thought that was something that I had been training for my entire life, was this life that I would live in a wheelchair. And when I started looking at my wheelchair as a sport, instead of something that confined me or defined me, I realized that this was the very thing that could set me free. And so once I made that switch in my head, when I reframed what I was thinking, when I was thinking about myself not as somebody who had a disability, but somebody who had a new kind of ability, maybe even a superhuman ability, that everything in my life changed. It was when I became an athlete, and I participated in my very first triathlon. And that triathlon was a sprint race that was located in Fort Collins, Colorado, which was about an hour north of where I live. And before I was going to do the race, I decided that I needed to call the race director and make sure that it was okay that I came and did the race. And when I called him on the phone, I introduced myself and I said, "My name is Tricia Downing, and I'm in a wheelchair, and I'd like to do your triathlon." And the other end of the line was silent. And I knew he was thinking, how is this person who has a disability, who's in a wheelchair, going to be able to do a triathlon? And so I started explaining to him how I learned when I was in the hospital that I could ride a hand cycle, which was equivalent to a bike, and how I could push a racing chair that was equivalent to one of you doing a running race, and how I had relearned how to swim, and that I was confident that I could swim 450 yards, which was what was in this triathlon. And so he said, "I have no idea how to help you, but you're more than welcome to bring your support crew with you, and you'll be able to do my race." And so I gathered those support crew members that I told you about before, mostly my cheerleaders, and I took them up north to Fort Collins to the race this one day. And as we got to the pool, I pushed in and I was looking around, and all I could see in front of me were these tan and fit bodies. And there I was comparing myself to these people who were able-bodied, or temporarily able-bodied, as we say, because anybody could get a disability at any time. But I was comparing myself, just like you guys might compare yourself to another student, or your roommate, or your brother, or your sister. And so I was looking at them and thinking, there's no way that I can be like they are because I have a disability and they don't. And I was feeling down about myself and feeling sorry for myself. But on this day at this race, we were going to do what's called a snake swim, and we were going to do it in time trial format. And so the snake swim meant you swam up one lane and down the next, and up one next and down the next, all the way across this pool. And so we all lined up around the pool in a snake formation, and I was the end of the snake because I was the slowest. But as I looked up in the bleachers and I saw all those faces looking down at me, I felt more like the butt of a joke, because what was somebody with a disability doing there at that race? And so I watched as each of the racers dove into the water and started doing their swims, and the line got shorter and shorter and shorter, and finally it got to be my turn. And you know how sometimes when you want to do something new and you maybe just kind of want to put your toe in the water and test and see if you might be able to do it. Well, my friends, my support crew, those mentors and coaches and cheerleaders, they lifted me out of my chair and they put me on the side of the pool, and they literally shoved me into the water. So I had no choice but to start swimming. And so I swam backstroke, and I swam it up and down the pool, and eventually I swam all the way across. And when I got to the end of the pool, I touched the wall, and I was so excited because I had accomplished that. I had accomplished the 450-yard swim. And so I looked up into the bleachers because I wanted to see everybody looking down on me. I wanted to see this standing ovation and all the smiles on everybody's faces. And when I looked up into the bleachers, they were empty. And I looked around the pool deck, and it was empty. Everybody had left because all of the other racers were done with the swim. And the only people who were left on the deck were my 5 friends that I brought to help me. And they lifted me out of the water, they put me into my chair, and they helped me get outside to the area that's called transition. And in transition, it's where you change from the swim to the bike and the bike to the run. And so when I got out there, it was full of bike racks, and all the bike racks were empty because everybody was out on the bike. And so I got onto my bike, and my arms felt like noodles. I was absolutely exhausted after swimming 450 yards. But I got on my bike, and I started riding, and I got out onto the course. And this course was 3 laps of 4 miles each. It was a 12-mile course. And when I got out there, all the other racers were out there. And fortunately, they started to see me as another racer as opposed to seeing me as just a person in a wheelchair. And they started cheering for me. And they were saying things like, "Go Wheels, we're so glad you're out here, you can do this." And so I rode around in that first lap, and I felt pretty good about myself. But then on the second lap, there were fewer and fewer cyclists out there. And the ones that were out there were blowing by me on these huffy mountain bikes, and their helmets turned on backwards because they were the rookies. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm getting passed by these first-timers, the non-athletes, and I'm an athlete. But then on my last lap, I was the only racer out there. I was all by myself. And again, as I was riding along, I had that demon that was sitting on my shoulder, and it was saying that girls in wheelchairs don't do triathlons. You can't do this kind of a race if you have a disability. And I was trying to fight with that demon and saying things like, I can do the same thing but in a different way. Or I had the discipline of working hard, doing a little more every day, staying patient and not giving up. But that wasn't working. But what finally worked was that I remembered back to a bike race that I had done a few years earlier before my accident. And I was riding by myself on the course because I had bonked in the middle of the race. I hadn't been eating well, and all my friends and the other racers, they were way ahead of me, and I was just riding alone trying to get to the finish line. And another woman from one of the other categories rode up next to me, and she started talking to me, making small talk with me, and she said, how you doing? How's your race? And I looked at her and I said, I suck. And she said, you can't define yourself as a racer by just one race. And she said, you can only do what your body can do on any given day. And she told me I had to ride my own race. And so I started thinking that in this triathlon where here I was, the only wheelchair racer in this competition. There was no way that I could compare myself against all the other people. There was no way that I could define myself as a person, whether I had a disability or not, by just one race. Just like you can't define yourself as a student by just one test or just one class. And so I started thinking to myself that I needed to ride my own race. So I got into the transition area again where I was going to change from the bike to the run. And as I entered the transition area, again, it was empty. But it wasn't because everybody else was out on their bike. It was because they were finished with the race and they were probably at home with their feet up and eating their lunch. And here I was just about to embark on the run. And so I got into my racing chair and I started pushing out of the transition area. And at this point, I'm feeling a little sorry for myself. And I was looking down and I was looking at the cracks in the ground and counting how many ants that I could be faster than. And I'm pushing along, and I had 3.1 miles to do. It was a 5K. And eventually, as I was pushing, I started saying to myself, ride my own race. Ride my own race. And then I looked up, and I saw in front of me that there was this healthy, albeit tired, able-bodied runner, and I thought, dude, you're going down. So I started pushing, and I pushed so hard I finally passed that guy. And I realized at that moment that I wasn't last anymore. And so I pushed even more, further and harder, and I passed another runner, and another runner, and another runner. And by the time that I crossed the finish line, I had passed 7 runners in total. And at that point, I crossed the line with my arms up in victory. And it wasn't because I got first place or 10th place or 40th place. But I realized that I was an athlete. And that day, I realized how many people's perceptions I could change as a person with a disability. Because in the morning, the race director went from speechless to surprised. And at the beginning of the race, the other athletes were looking at my disability. But by the end of the race, they could see my ability. And I even changed my own perception about what I was capable of, because I realized that when you get out of your comfort zone, but you stay the course, that's when you grow. And I think that that is the actual lesson that I wanted to teach you today, in that when things change, you have to change the way that you deal with them. When you start in a new situation, whether it's at school here at Wallace State or when you start a new job, certainly there are these assets that you need. You need the asset of having a support crew like I had that day at the race. They were there for me, whether I was out of the water first or last, and they were cheering for me no matter what happened in the race. I had the discipline to train for that race, where I had to work hard, do a little more every day, stay patient, and don't give up. And I believed in myself at some point. I at least changed my mind. In the beginning, I might not have believed in myself, but now I always tell myself, always believe you can do it. No matter what the challenge is in front of you, if you believe it, you can definitely achieve it. And I want to leave you with those lessons today, because I think those are the important things that you might hopefully got out of reading The Cycle of Hope. And those are some of the important lessons that I got out of coming back from this accident, from this injury, that things are going to change in your life. Things aren't going to go from point A to point B. Although, when I got out of the high school, that's how I thought they happened. But they don't. They take you on this crazy ride, and you never know what's going to happen at each turn. And it might be something good, it might be something bad, but I've learned that out of the bad things often come amazing things. And as a result of my injury, as a result of my disability, I started to see my life differently. I started to see my challenges differently, and I pushed myself harder than I ever would have done. Before my accident, I was sort of floating through my days, going from one job to the next, trying to figure out who I was. But after my accident, I became a dedicated, hardcore athlete, and I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to finish the longest triathlon that there is, the Ironman. I wanted to make it to the Paralympic Games. In my professional life, I wanted to help other people, and so I started a nonprofit. And last summer, I competed for Team USA at the Rio Paralympic Games. And so I want to leave you with the fact that just because bad things happen, just because things don't go on that direct path, you can still live your life as though it was a best-selling novel with adventure and intrigue and the good times and the bad, and keep moving forward. And in the end, you will find that if you believe in yourself and you keep pushing yourself past your comfort zone, that you will ultimately succeed. Thank you for having me here today. I'd love to answer any questions that you all have about the book, my injury, my accident, or things that I'm working on now, but I'd like to open it up to questions. And I think we have some microphones coming down here too. Does anybody have a question for me? Okay, in the back row there.
I'm here representing the diagnostic imaging program here at Wallace State, and I was going to see if you could share some stories or something you might remember about your experiences in the x-ray department while you were in the hospital.
Okay. Well, my first experience, I've had a lot of experiences. I've had way more experiences in a hospital than I'd ever like to imagine or to talk about, but my first experience was being rolled into the emergency room by the paramedics and having nurses and doctors all around me. And that night of the accident, I had to go through a whole battery of tests because they had no idea how badly I had been injured. And so I had X-ray, MRI, CT scan. And from that night, I just remember being in a lot of pain. I obviously had just been hit by a car, which is a very painful thing. Don't try it. But I was in a lot of pain, and I remember them trying to get me into the different machines and trying to move my body in different ways, and all I could ask for was, please give me some pain medications. I remember they wanted to raise my arm above my head, and I had actually broken my right scapula, and it was the most painful thing ever. But the thing that I found about not just the emergency room professionals or those who helped me through x-ray and the different diagnostics, but the people who really took the time to hold my hand, to tell me it was going to be okay, the people who were reassuring to me, those are the people who helped set the stage for my healing and who set the stage for me being successful. And I think that as a medical professional, that's one of the most important things that you can remember, is that you're not only helping somebody through one of the most difficult times of their lives, you're not only helping them, helping to diagnose them, but that's the beginning of the healing. And I think it's important to, be able to have that positive attitude and the positive outlook, and to be able to share with people, this is something that other people have gotten through successfully. It's of course difficult in the beginning, but to be able to share stories of people who have been through this, who've come out the other side, who have been successful. One of my favorite nurses was a woman named Pam, and she sat on my bed one night. She was the night nurse, and she sat on my bed, and she told me story after story of successful people who had come through the ICU and had experienced paralysis, but the things that they were doing and the ways that they had been able to, get their lives started again. And, that gave me so much encouragement, because I was so scared that my life was over. I was so scared that I wasn't going to be able to, make it through this. So I think, for your question, just no matter what part of the medical field you're involved in, is realize that you're dealing with a person and their life has just been turned upside down. And you are that person who is there not just to diagnose, but also to give hope. And if you can do that as a medical professional, I believe that that is the greatest gift that you can give a patient. Yes? Why did I write the story in parts? It sort of just ended up that way. It's interesting, I think, as a writer, and this was my first book. I'm currently have 2 writing projects going on at the same time right now, but I actually wrote this book in 9 days. I thought about it for 6 years, and I tried to, as they say, put pen to paper, although I did it all on a computer, but I tried to put pen to paper for 6 years, and it wasn't coming out. Like, every time I sat down, there were no words that came out. And then finally, I got to a point where I really did want the book to come out, and so I hired a ghostwriter. And, she took me through, a lot of different interviews so that we could kind of figure out where to start. And she wrote the first 3 chapters of the book, and she gave them to me, and I read them, and I cried because they were horrible. They were absolutely horrible. And, I realized that somebody else can't get inside your head. I mean, I know there are authors who are ghostwriters and do a great job, but I just felt it was so personal and so emotional that I just couldn't use what she wrote. And so I sat down, and I was so mad. I was trying to type out all the corrections that she needed to make. And finally I was like, why am I correcting this when I can just write it myself? And so I just started writing, and it was just like, it just came out. And then once I got the story down on paper, I had taken a writing class a few years earlier, and somebody had brought up the Bible verse that I used at the beginning of the book. And so I was telling my mom about it, and she's like, oh, I know exactly what verse that is and where to find it. And she found it, and it just fit. It was like, and then after I picked that, then I was with a mastermind group, it was a group of speakers and writers who got together regularly to help each other with our programs and our jobs and stuff. And someone had mentioned Cycle of Hope as the title, because I was, we wanted to have the cycle in there, we wanted to have the hope part in there, and then I realized that between the Bible verse and Cycle of Hope, that's actually what I went through. And I've tried to develop it more now. We start in these places where things aren't going well, or something bad has happened, or a change has happened, and we get in this cycle from the bad part, and we cycle around to the good part. And that's, I think life is continually this cycle. And when you get into these difficult situations, or these changes, or these challenges, you need to be able to have that hope in the back of your mind at all times, so that you can get through those difficult times, and you can cycle around from the bad parts to the good parts. And so it just started to fall into place, and then I realized that there was a part of suffering, and there was a part of endurance, and that like all of these things cycled around and led me to the hope that I now have, that my life can be just as good as anybody else's, regardless of the fact that I have a disability. Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, she was asking about how my dad basically said my life was over. And now I think I've showed him, my dad he's an older generation. He's in his 80s now. And when he was a young kid, one of his neighbor friends was paralyzed in a trampoline accident. And at that time, people with paralysis didn't live very long. They didn't know the kinds of things that they know now about how to take care, of our bodies and that kind of thing. And so my dad really, he was coming from a place of just pure honesty and like, oh no, this is my daughter and her life is over because of, his experience with this kid when he was growing up. But now that he's seen that, I've gone off to the Paralympics games in Rio, and that I got to go to the White House and meet the president, and that I've written a book, and that I've traveled the country speaking, he sees that there's so much more to life, and it's actually completely changed his perception about what is possible with people with disabilities. And I was recently at a speaking, somebody else was speaking and talking about the different generations. And his generation of traditionalists is a generation that, their experiences with people with disabilities is not positive. It's not, people with disabilities aren't empowered. People with disabilities did not, they were in institutions, they were, all kinds of these different things. And so he was really just coming from that generational perspective, whereas you guys are generation, are we calling you Z? You guys Generation Z now? So, you guys have seen people with disabilities. You see them out, on the street going to work, or you see them, doing all kinds of things. You see athletics. Hopefully you all have seen the Paralympics, things like that. And so you're coming from a different place, and hopefully when you see somebody with a disability, you don't have that same feeling that, oh, that poor person, their life is over. Hopefully you see their life with much more positivity, because there is so much more that's possible for people with disabilities now. Other questions? Yeah. What difference is common in what? I think it depends on the individual person. She's talking about differences in interactions. There definitely is a difference. Even though I think people are more open to disabilities and understanding disabilities, there has definitely been a difference in the way people talk to me or view me. And so sometimes education is, I do a lot of educating of people, and I think a lot of people are surprised to hear about the things that I've done. For me, as an athlete, I think it's a little bit easier, because for whatever reason, people gravitate toward athletes, whether they're able-bodied or have a disability, and are often enamored by athletic capabilities and things like that. But I definitely still run across, prejudices. I still run across discrimination, people who think that, if you have a disability, you can't do anything. But I can tell you, I drove myself to the airport in Denver, and I got on the airplane, and I flew across the country, and I landed in Atlanta, and I went and I rented my own car, and I drove my own car here to Alabama, and am here speaking to you today. And I did all of that independently. I didn't have anybody travel with me. There are people who ask you, the guy at the hotel last night asked me, are you with somebody? Did somebody drop you off? He's asking me all these questions. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, I do this all the time. And so you still run into that, where people think that you're different and think that you can't do the same things that everybody else does. But in truth, what my therapist Stacy told me about, I would still be able to do all the same things I had ever done. I would just have to do them differently. That has absolutely been my experience. I've done everything I've wanted to do. I've just had to do it differently. Yes? The driver immediately at the accident said that she wasn't paying attention. She was lost, and she was looking at directions. This was obviously before Siri told us which turns to take and things. But it was, the sun was fall in the sky, kind of like coming down. And so I think she was looking at directions and then looked up into the sun and didn't see the two cyclists in front of her. So, it was an accident. She did stop, but unfortunately there's really not much protection for cyclists in the law. The driver just gets the ticket. Other questions? Yeah. Did I harbor bad feelings for the driver? I think there have been times, yes, that I have, but ultimately I realized that that's not productive, that I can't go back and change the situation. I can't do anything to her, or, I can be mad at her if I want to be, but that just turns me into a negative person. And I am, overwhelmingly a pretty positive person. And so having bad feelings toward the driver, I don't want to go have lunch with her necessarily, but having bad feelings toward her is not helpful. It just doesn't help you heal. I'll come back to you. Is there anybody in the back, though, more that has other questions? Okay. She's asking if I have any nightmares or PTSD from the accident, and I never really had any nightmares about the accident, but occasionally, like last week, in fact, right by my house, there's a bike path that I ride on, and there's a crosswalk that the cars don't stop automatically, even though they're supposed to. And the other morning, I saw a bike down on the ground, a car stopped, and an ambulance and police car. And so when I saw that, it gives me a little bit of a jump, and it's, like I need to get away from that. But in general, I think I've done pretty well since the accident. But it's just, when I see those reminders, it just reminds me that, that life is really not a given. And had I not had a helmet on the day of my accident, I would not be here sitting in front of you. So, anything could happen to any one of us at any time. And in every day that my husband goes out and gets on his motorcycle, is a day that I worry. But at the same time, you can't stop living. And we're both, cycling enthusiasts, and he loves his motorcycle, and that's part of life is, you do fun things, and, you want to hope that you stay safe, but sometimes it doesn't happen. Yes. Well, I couldn't have done anything without a physical therapist, because I went through Craig Rehabilitation Hospital, which is one of the top 10 rehab hospitals for spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury rehabilitation. And, a physical therapist taught me how to get around. I mean, I have to be able to transfer from this chair to be able to get into my bed or the shower bench or the car or anywhere I want to go. And so the physical therapy, that was basically teaching me how to use a wheelchair, how to get in it, get out of it. And without the physical therapist, I would not have been able to move beyond the bed. So it's fortunate that I had that. And so I worked with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and recreation therapy. And all of those people contributed to me being able to do each one of the skills that I need to do to get through the day. Yes. Well, yeah, that made me really mad in the beginning, and but sometimes those things you need to hear even when you don't want to hear them. Every therapist at Craig, I think they must teach you to say this. That you'll still be able to do all the same things you ever could. You just have to do them in a different way. And in the beginning, it was maddening because I was hearing it from somebody who was able-bodied, who could stand up and walk out of the room after they told me that. And it wasn't until later that I began to appreciate that was, in fact, the truth, that I could do anything I wanted to do. I just have to do it differently. And I think when you've been put in this kind of a situation where you're paralyzed and you're working with all people who don't haven't experienced paralysis, it's hard. And I think that's hard on both sides of the medical equation, is that you're trying to tell me something that you don't have experience with. But that happens every day. A doctor who doesn't have cancer is trying to tell a patient that they're going to be okay with their cancer, or that there's cures, or something like that. So I think that you just have to keep saying it. You do have to, and it's something that's important to hear, that there are ways to get through this. But I think it's also nice to have some role models. Like Stacy brought in one of her friends who was he had been injured about 4 years earlier than I had, and he was a competitive cyclist. And so she brought him into the hospital, and she'd tell me the lesson, but she's like, if you don't believe me, listen to this guy. So it was nice that I had some people who actually ended up being my mentors and who were the role models that I could look at and say, okay, they've done it, I can do it too. So, having kind of that arsenal of different stories that you can share with somebody and say, it is possible, this can happen. Does that help? Other questions? Yes. How did I learn to swim again? My swimming, the first time I tried it in the hospital, it was an absolute disaster. Claire, who was my recreational therapist, took me down to the pool, and I thought I'd be able to swim no problem because I had been a swimmer since I was 4 years old. But as it turns out, I wasn't a good swimmer at all with just this dead weight on my body. I didn't realize my legs didn't float the way they had floated before my accident, so I just had dead weight, and I kept sinking to the bottom of the pool, and fortunately she kept pulling me up. And finally she just, the first day was a disaster. I didn't learn how to swim then, but she brought me back in on another day, and we just kind of started from the very beginning like I did when I was a kid, and I learned the back float, and then I started doing the backstroke, and ever since then I've done more backstroke than any of the other strokes, which is sort of untraditional when you're talking about doing triathlons, especially doing the Ironman. I'm the only person who's done the Hawaii Ironman, I think, completely on my back, swimming backstroke, but that's kind of how I learned to swim again, was just going back to the very beginning and learning all my skills over again.
Hey, so sorry to interrupt, but we need to end to make sure students can make it to their 11 o'clock classes. But let's give Ms. Downing a round of applause and thank her for coming today.
Thank you.